members here. We have Nick Johnston, who you've already heard give a great talk. We have David Dagon, who's going to give a talk tomorrow, so you get a preview of David. And we have the great Colin. So these people... We're going to try leaving the microphone on the table rather than pass it back and forth. If you can't hear what's going on, please holler at our AV guy there who will tweak things if necessary. So I'm going to ask a couple questions. We have a list of topics in my handwriting here, but after we can just start the discussion, ask these folks what it is they're interested in, what they're working on and researching, what they're doing. You can ask follow-up questions, and then later on in the hour, you can throw out some topics of your own once you sort of get a feeling of what these folks know about and what they're interested in. Let's try and keep the topics focused on something we can reasonably answer. So we're going to do our best here to entertain you and educate you and find out a little bit more about these three guys that are sitting up here in front of you today. So I'm going to throw out the first question. That's for Colin, who is working on crypto anarchy and social change. And it sounds like you're working on some sort of cypherpunk movement. And could you explain to us what the heck is crypto anarchy and why is it important? And what are you trying to do? Are you trying to break the world or what?
Yeah, so I'm not the only person involved in the movement, of course. I mean, everyone here is. If you use anonymity software or encryption software, you are fighting the man, essentially. You have said that you want to have a right to read, you want to have a right to privacy, you want to have a right to speak freely without anyone telling you otherwise. So the principles of crypto anarchy are taking the principles of anarchism, if anyone's familiar with that, so hating hierarchical structures, so hating centralized authority, centralized power, moving with the principles of mutual aid, so we're all helping each other out. Running an I2P relay, for example, is a great way of doing mutual aid because your router becomes part of the network and anyone can use your router. Running a Tor relay is also another example of mutual aid. I run both, for example. The cypherpunk movement is also a little different than crypto anarchy, but a lot of members are very closely associated with both movements. The cypherpunk movement is a way to use encryption software as a vehicle for social change. So tell people who are behind oppressive governments, such as Iran or China, the current punching bags, have them run a Tor bridge. Have them use Tor to communicate, which otherwise might be censored. So I think that that's sort of a good high level of it. Anything else anyone wants to know?
Who's in charge?
Who's the leader of the anarchists, you mean? So we don't like hierarchical structures. We don't like centralized power. So the only answer is, of course, ZZZ. But
I better not be the answer, no matter what the question is.
Other than ZZZ, there are no leaders.
So, how long have you been involved in this? And again, I'm still having trouble grasping what crypto anarchy is. You all get in some secret chat room and plot against the government, or what? What is this?
No, so
tell me more.
Yeah, so it's mostly bringing the principles of anarchism that Emma Goldman and many other great anarchist philosophers have been writing about for years, and applying it to the internet, applying it to this new frontier that we have, so that we all can communicate freely, we all can help each other out when needed.
Is it okay for I2P to associate with the anarchists, or are the anarchists too wild for me? Should I stay away from you guys?
So that's entirely the I2P project's opinion. If you guys,
I don't know what our opinion is.
Yeah, if as a consensus the I2P project decides that they wish to ally themselves with the principles of battling against hierarchical structures, wanting to give each other mutual aid when needed and help each other out, then by all means, you can ally yourselves with it.
Well, would you say a conference like this, is this anarchic, or is this the absolute opposite of anarchic? Are we so organized that anarchists wouldn't want anything to do with this? Are we being legitimate or illegitimate here with this event?
Well, I don't think we're being illegitimate because we're not oppressing people.
Okay.
We are making software, and we're helping educate people to use this software so that they can actually have freedom, so that they don't have to be constricted if they are behind oppressive regimes, or even if there's like a local adversary on the network. Any one of those steps helps, regardless of the power of the adversary. As the more we use encryption, the more we win.
Okay. Thanks. While we're talking about conferences and anarchy, something that is maybe even, is it more anarchic or less? Maybe it's so big that it's not anarchic, or maybe it never was. Nick, I know you were at DEF CON last week. What would you say about DEF CON and how it relates to smaller conferences like this? Is DEF CON just an organized corporate event? What did you see when you were out there? Anything notable? Any highlights from DEF CON? Was anybody else at DEF CON last week? Yeah?
So, loaded question on the organized corporate event. I mean, it started out really small, right? The first couple DEF CONs, they were at some tiny little hotel. I wasn't at those ones. But, I mean, it's grown to the point where I think during the closing ceremonies, they said they had a 15% increase in attendance over last year. So that puts them pretty darn close to 20,000 attendees. And I mean, on the main floor, again, I love a lot of the stuff that happens at DEF CON, but I did see some criticism of the fact that there were like 3 Teslas and 3 giant banners for Tesla in the main contest floor. Now, Tesla donated them for people to try to hack and break and do stuff, but I don't know if in the past they would have had these big banners advertising the fact that they were Teslas. But in terms of some other cool stuff that was there, I think probably one of the best things I saw was the IEEE's Let's Encrypt initiative, where basically they're trying to make a service to mint strong crypto certificates, basically for free, to try to get strong crypto in the hands of pretty much every web server and service out there, so that you don't have to pay crazy fees to have strong crypto for your websites. That was a great talk. It's something that they're going to be launching towards the end of the year. That was definitely one of the best things I saw.
Sorry to interrupt, but you might want to speak up a little bit. It's a little bit
Thanks. Okay. And in terms of other stuff, I mean, it is a fun time. If you're going to get the chance to go, I would totally recommend going to DEF CON, because it's still a lot of fun. Somebody might have dumped a bunch of bubble bath into one of the fountains at the Paris casino, and bubbles overflowed, and funny stuff. But yeah, no, it's a great 4 loaded days in the desert. I hope you can deal with the fact that it's in the desert in the summer, but it's a lot of fun.
How many people have ever been to a DEF CON? Wow, not too many. How many people have... Is this their first conference ever? First? I don't know if this is a hacker conference. Almost everybody, this is your first conference? That's great. That's really great. What did you see any other trends at DEF CON? I know a big thing was car hacking. And now all the hackers have turned from whatever their focus was last year to cars.
Cars and other embedded systems was another big theme. They built an entire, they call them villages, but they're basically just large workshops, right? So they had an Internet of Things village where people brought in all kinds of different embedded devices that were network equipped. And people were basically just looking for vulnerabilities. I forget the stat off the top of my head, but something like they found hundreds of vulnerabilities in the devices that were submitted. Really just driving home the point that, 1, why do we need to stick a Wi-Fi adapter and everything? But 2, if we're going to do that, we really need to be really conscious of the embedded systems that are in these things. They're not as easy to patch and update as other software, and we really need to take the security of those systems seriously, because they can leak all kinds of information about you. I don't know who wants to know what's in my fridge, but if somebody could exploit my Wi-Fi fridge, they could totally find out. So,
great, thanks.
No problem.
David, I know you've been involved with looking at these laws that were not adopted, like SOPA and PIPA, and researching how laws like that may actually break the internet, or more particularly break DNS, which is the address lookup mechanism for the internet. And there are more, even though those laws were rejected a couple of years ago, right?
Mhm.
And there are new versions of those being proposed right now. Could you tell us a little bit about your research and your involvement in
Sure.
in those laws, and what we can learn from those efforts to reject those laws and make sure they weren't passed, and is that threat coming back again today?
Sure. So many years ago, ICANN contacted me and a few other researchers that focus on DNS and network research, and were asking our opinion about whether some proposed legislation around DNS filtering would affect certain security extensions. Would it have a negative effect on the operation of the internet? And so, this came out of the blue. We decided to look closely at some of the proposed legislation. Some of you might recall this was known as SOPA-PIPA, but actually this predates that. Even before it was called SOPA-PIPA, it was called COICA. And so for 1 year, we were looking at the legislation, and we noticed that it would have actually a very deleterious effect on security extensions for DNS. We wrote a very lengthy, many of us are in academia or have been in academia, so the output was a very large white paper from engineers and researchers saying this is a problem for the internet. And we ended up, as a byproduct of that, meeting with representatives in Congress over several years. We had, I've lost count, it's over 30 or 40 individual meetings. The way they work is a lobbyist sets this up, and you literally go from 15-minute to 15-minute meeting running all day long. So on some days we had 16 meetings, I think was the maximum. But nonetheless, we went from place to place. We weren't there as lobbyists. We didn't represent an interest beyond simply the mathematical observation that what was proposed in the legislation, A, was impossible, B, if implemented, would break a lot of things, and was in our opinion, bad policy. And so this actually had an effect over the 2-year period. Eventually, near the end, the rest of the internet community started waking up saying, this legislation looks quite bad, and we understand there's some technical objections. And then the press started getting more involved. But we were able, for the first year and a half, to essentially play this defensive role, saying that this would be bad policy, it would be a bad decision, regardless of your opinion about copyright protection or whether piracy is wrong or not. Regardless of that, what's being called for in the legislation is mathematically impossible and foolish to require in legislation. And so I guess the historical message from that is actually a very nice balance to the crypto anarchy movement. We actually need both. We need people that are radical thinkers, creative thinkers. But if your temperament is to work more within the system, at least in my experience, it's certainly possible to get involved and have an effect. There's one thing I would mention as a follow-up to that. There was a question earlier about the TLD status of .I2P. That's a great area right now where we need essentially advocates and level-headed people. If you subscribe to some of the mailing lists and go back and read some of the exchanges, I don't know that it serves the cause of I2P or any of the anonymity communities to have essentially shouting matches about this. If you are a level-headed person who can simply explain what I2P is, or even just explain your interest in privacy, your involvement would be welcomed in the IETF process. As much like, I guess, Congress, in the sense you can just walk in and start talking to people. You don't have to have some special role or resources. And if you go to a certain number of IETF meetings, you can actually start voting on things, despite not having an engineering background or been involved in software development or whatnot. So there's a need for sort of calm, level-headed advocates who can just help explain to some people who are not critics of I2P, but just honestly don't know why should we provide this status to this funny-looking domain name, and what does it mean to people? Yeah.
Concerning SOPA and PIPA, I believe that the TPP and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they're trying to work all these things into these trade agreements,
And
so-called trade.
And FISA
Right.
and CETA and just about every other trade agreement that's on the table in Canada today.
Right. So in terms of the follow-up for that, a couple of things happened. First, one of the major early proponents of the SOPA, PIPA, the pro-copyright protection, essentially changed much of their position. You wouldn't believe it, but Comcast, as an organization, decided that it's far better to offer people a coupon instead of a demand letter or threatening emails from a lawyer. And so instead of trying to block people, they said, well, look, we'll never win this, and it's actually a PR disaster for the company. They felt that they could compete on quality. They could say, well, the pirated content may not be as good, may lack closed captioning, may lack certain language features that users might want, and so they could offer a higher quality version with discount. And so the experience of many of the customers that were originally worried about being flagged for piracy was that they were, in some cases, being offered a discount for a subscription as an alternative. And so the opinion of many people in the content community is that a lot of this information out there that they wanted to control really can't be. What they're now focused on are the people that are monetizing and making money off of piracy, as opposed to just normal users who want to watch something. And so people who are offering subscription services where you can download movies for a fee, that's something that they're focused on and going after. And of course, one of the side effects is that doesn't characterize the entire industry, but within the industry there are maximalists, people who will never give up the position that what they have is essentially the ability to charge a premium for access to information. And so you're seeing things like TPP and provisions being put in wherever possible. You're also seeing legislation in some countries which attempts to enact this sort of, it's like the three-strike provision that France had experimented with. And I think, though, the experience with many of those countries is that it comes down to consent. If you have a user who's downloading something, regardless of whether or not what they're doing is technically illegal in some areas but not illegal in other parts of the world, that user is consenting to the content. And until you reason with the user, you cannot just vitiate that by putting a law in place saying, well, we're going to rewrite DNS or we're going to block things for you, because the user will always find another way around. In other cases, there's a lack of consent where malware is running on a person's machine. No one consents to running a virus. And so I think what you're going to start to see is a cleaner separation between the people who are arguing for cleaning up the internet, based on malware, and those who are interested in preserving their market position around owning copyrighted material. Originally, those were sort of mixed. They would say, well, movies might have viruses in them, the users are being defrauded, we're also victims as Hollywood content owners, and the issues were sort of melded in the minds of many policymakers. But now I think by focusing on who consented to what, you can have a cleaner separation of those issues. So no one wants a virus on their computer. No one consented to running a virus. And so there may be filtration and protection and means to stop that. But those mechanisms, those technical mechanisms, don't apply to situations where there is consent, simply because the user is going to go elsewhere. One statistical little anecdote. Some countries are blocking unwanted content using DNS. Some countries decided to do what SOPA PIPA was proposing. Turkey, for example, was blocking what the government deemed to be objectionable content using DNS rewriting. You would do a DNS lookup for a news site. It wasn't based on copyrighted content, but it's analogous. And what ended up happening is people started changing their DNS settings to ask different DNS servers. And so the country of Turkey is now exporting much of its DNS lookup to other countries for resolution. And in some places, if you look at some of the statistics, 10 to 15% of the Turkish ISP space is being exported in terms of DNS resolution. It's hard to measure. It's hard to really know whether that's an accurate count. But essentially what's happening is now, because people want to evade censorship, they're relying on other organizations where they have no relationship. They don't vote in the foreign countries. They don't have policy influence in those places where those DNS servers are that they're using. And those countries are now receiving a very nice stream of traffic and intelligence from people in those foreign lands whose rights they don't have to respect. And so it is as we predicted in our early white paper, a extremely bad development for jurisdictions that wish to impose this filtration. And so, yeah, you're right. There are maximalist positions taken in many of the copyright positions, but at least our experience was that if you can have a calm, reasoned discussion with people and just say, we probably disagree on a lot of things, including this definition of ownership and privacy of content, but here's our reasoned explanation of what will happen if this change occurs. If you can hold these sorts of simple, from-the-heart conversations, you're sorely needed right now in some of the IETF developments. And at least in my experience, it had a great impact on at least the U.S. legislation. And ironically, the country you would think least likely to have an unfunded $0 grassroots lobbying effort being successful.
Well, maybe what I want to do before we get to a couple more, before we go more in depth about that, is ask Nick whether you have any insight as to what's going on in Canada here as our Canadian person on the panel here up front. What's going on legally or privacy-wise in Canada that relates to the issues that David was talking about? Are there laws? Are there laws coming up that are about to really make things not so great in Canada?
So from what I heard, and I think you might have mentioned it, the one that we deep-sixed the other year, it's basically just reappeared again, but under another name, right? Under another heading and under another
what was
mandate.
the old name and what's the new name?
Oh, you got me there.
Anybody?
I don't recall.
CETA, TPP,
Thank
they're
you.
the three big ones on the table right
Okay.
now.
Yeah. And so they basically just keep getting rehashed under a new, like maybe a new mandate, right? They have some new rhetoric behind them, but it's the same set of suggestions, just repackaged and rebranded. So
You were invited to participate in developing this law in the United States. But from our perspective, these are generally U.S.-driven laws or trade agreements, and they're top secret. Even the politicians don't have access to the contents of those laws. How can we possibly participate and even determine whether or not there's anything deleterious in these laws?
Right.
That's a good point. It seems like the U.S. philosophies get exported all the time, and that's been going on for decades, but on these sort of technology policy issues, it can have a real pernicious effect of whatever the U.S. thinks is right gets exported everywhere. What happens with that?
I guess as the U.S. rep on the panel, my apologies for that export. We did what we could to stop those sorts of developments in the U.S. legislative process and had good effect. My understanding of Canadian law is that there is a very deep tradition here of transparency and accountability. Well, you may snicker, but I'm historical is it now? Well, nonetheless, it is something that you can have a reasoned discussion with elected representatives about. I know it sounds futile, and I certainly felt like I was being sent on a fool's errand, being asked to go to D.C. and meet with representatives. I went there for the spectacle of it. I just wanted to see what it would be like. And I was shocked that people would listen to us and have debates and discussions. At the end of the day, many of these people are elected representatives. We absolutely need people that are shouting and leading the drumbeat and saying we will create technology that moots your effort to control speech and thought. We absolutely need that. But at the same time, a lot of these people wish to be reelected. And if you can raise your voices collectively loud enough, they may take notice. So I don't have an answer for the secrecy part. Personally, I find that just shocking. And I understand that occasionally some aspects of government work need to be conducted but I don't see any of the traditional aspects where you would think that would apply, law enforcement or investigations or security. These are policy documents being developed. So I'm troubled by that. I am confident that ultimately, though, in the full light, nothing will be a better disinfectant than sunlight. And so eventually, as these documents and terms become public, there's an expectation that the public read and comment on this, and please coordinate with your elected representatives to let them know of all the things you care about, of all the various aspects of living in Canada, all of the things they must vote on your behalf. This is your issue, and this is what you care about. They need to know that.
I also think, too, at a technical level, we do need these privacy by design software like I2P, Tor, TextSecure, Signal. These are all things that allow us to take back what has been eroded over the last 20 years or so. And we can try as much as we want, legislation-wise, to reel it back. But if we make a firm stand and say, no, we're not giving this up, now we now have them on the defensive. Now they have to try and work with us.
Well, let's talk about privacy by design and how do we do that. Shifting a little bit here. Privacy by design, we all know, is hard, and it's especially difficult when what we're designing is the pipe. And privacy by design is great until the user gets involved. Privacy by design can be impossible once the user opens a browser. We don't do an I2P version of a browser. We don't think we have the resources to do it. Maybe we should. Maybe it's hopeless if we don't do it. But maybe, and again, that chart that I showed of Alice talking to Google, if we don't control Alice's browser and we don't control Google, is it even possible to do privacy by design? What do you think about that? Is privacy by design feasible for what we're trying to do, or is it only feasible for some sort of very special purpose application? What do you think?
So that's the reasoning that the Tor project has had with the Tor browser, is people are going to use Tor, and we need to make sure that we control how they use it. Because if you do not use Tor in the approved way, so for those of you who aren't familiar, Tor browser, it's a browser you download from torproject.org, allows you to run Tor. However, there's a lot more behind it than just it's a browser that passes through a SOX proxy and lets you get to Tor. They have removed features at compile time out of Firefox, the base of the browser. They have added privacy patches to it, all to make sure that it is very hard for the user to disclose information. So one big thing earlier this year, late last year, was WebRTC. If you connect over Tor with WebRTC enabled in your browser, you're giving your real IP address away. That's just a function of how the protocol works.
So do you think if we don't have an I2P browser, is it hopeless? Do we have to do an I2P browser in order to have a privacy by design system?
So
or can we rely on somebody else, or what do you think?
I think it would help.
Well, sure, it would help.
Yeah, of course. But I think it would help user adoption, of course, not having to configure their browser in a certain way. I believe that's one of the hurdles behind the I2P project and why it's not as widely adopted.
Nick, what do you think about it?
Sure. Yeah, I would say there's still plenty of good services you can use the internet for outside of a browser, though, right?
Right.
Like
But does anybody care about anything that's not a browser? We
Yeah.
say we can do IRC, we can do BitTorrent. Does anybody care? Or
So-
people just want to check their Facebook?
So
and,
I would say look at the success of something like Dropbox, right?
Okay.
I find few people use Dropbox through the web interface because the desktop app or the smartphone app is so convenient. That entire platform could be maybe not even browser-based, but it's so effective. It's everywhere. Loads of people use it. And I don't know, has anybody ever tried a distributed anonymous file system inside I2P?
I've never used Dropbox. How many people use Dropbox? Is it that easy? Is he right? Yeah?
It's pretty darn easy. If there's a folder on my desktop that I can drag files into.
It's mindless, actually. You really don't even need to think while you're using it.
What do you think, David? Are we smoking something here? Trying to save the world, or
I think the file sharing services, there are many of them. As an industry, they're moving away from a plain text storage system. Originally, they wanted to have your files stored in plain text on their server, perhaps delivered over SSL, but still readable on their end. simply to save on hard drives. If everyone had 15 copies of the same movies, they'd only save one and have 15 indicators that people had copies of that movie. But if you encrypt everything, of course, everything's encrypted, everything looks different, and so you have to buy large numbers of hard drives because every user's media collection cannot be deduplicated against every other user. And so that experiment has been run by the market, and it looks like most of the providers are switching to an all-encryption system where they have no knowledge of what the users are storing. And this is simply so they can bow out of the rainfall of subpoenas and takedowns and demand notices that would otherwise drive up their abuse costs, their abuse management costs. So simply, by the volume of lawyers that have already been put onto this problem, the network providers have decided things like Dropbox and others will use a key-based system. Only you have the password. They don't know what you're storing. And so, this is not an endorsement of any one, but it seems like all of them in industry are moving towards that. Those that don't, of course, are facing incrementally higher costs for compliance.
Well, do you think it's hopeless? Do we have to do a browser, which we could never do?
So Tor, I would look at the history of Tor, maybe ask some of the early developers. They tried originally very good documentation, and people messed things up, and you had the Tor DNS loop issues. And then they tried creating a plugin, so you can take most any version of Firefox you like, so long as it runs this particular plugin. But then they found that people were not turning it on and turning it off properly. They would visit a site under Tor, turn the proxy off, and then now they're leaking information back over the plain text internet. So there's a lot of user interface reasoning that's been conducted by experimentation. And I think you should learn from it. My sense is if you build something, it should be fully dedicated to that task. So if you build if you deploy as a browser-based architecture, you should have a browser that can only do that. And if people wish to use another browser for things that aren't on I2P, number one, ask Facebook to put an I2P site up, ask that content be moved onto I2P. But secondly, let them go to Chrome or let them get out of that application that you are running. And that's sort of where Tor settled, because they reasoned that there were just so many mistakes that even fairly knowledgeable users have made. There's a lot of little gotchas about operations. So if you restrict it to a browser, you can lock it down much easier. You might work off of their code base and simply offer a forked configuration. Much of the security lockdowns you would all agree with in common with Tor. It's just the proxy settings.
The trouble is that browsers are just so huge and such monsters that we have always, and we're careful not to get started on something that's impossible if we can help it. And we've always thought that was impossible for the amount of resources that we have.
I think the analogy is software Vietnam. You can keep dumping engineers into it, and it just escalates.
So Firefox
never get out.
Firefox is a software Vietnam.
Yeah,
Okay,
you need
okay.
a lot of resources.
We need to get our press officers out as a press.
Perhaps not the best analogy for Canada.
Yeah.
But,
okay.
people in the U.S. get that.
Yeah. So let's step back a bit. Nick, where do you think I2P needs the most work? Where are we? I gave some hints in my talk. I'm going to give a lot more tomorrow. But from the outside looking in, where are we the most in trouble? What's our problem?
I wouldn't say so much in trouble, but I enjoyed your presentation, by the way. Thank you. That was great. While I understood sort of a lot of the architecture and the platform and things like that, I was struggling sometimes to find out like what's the use case for me, almost wanting to dial into a separate network and to operate and live inside that. So, and I think there are good use cases, and maybe that's, I don't know, I'm putting it out there, maybe that's one of the selling points. Why,
right.
Like, yeah, privacy's awesome, we're all behind that, but why else do I want to use this service? What else can I get to it? So that's why a few minutes ago I suggested something like a cool, redundant, distributed file system idea, maybe something along those lines.
And Snapchat over up2P would be another hit.
Good. And we one of our outreach efforts, which I hinted at a little bit, is getting people to bundle I2P into it. Maybe if they don't know it's I2P and it's just, so we get the other people that are making the applications, let them do the marketing and bundle in I2P. Maybe. Colin, what do you think? Where do we need the most work?
Yeah, so I think actual usable applications for. I'm not going to use the old adage of it needs to be easy enough for a grandmother or mother to use it, because I think that just gets into a whole mess. But if you look at applications like Signal or Redphone or TechSecure, their documentation is almost non-existent in that for a user, you do not need to know what a key is. You don't need to know what a signature is. You don't need to know key exchanges. You don't need to know all that. The application handles all it for you. Their approach to the application is the less options for the user, the better. Just because the more options you add to an application, the more you allow a user to start messing up. So with that in mind, I think if I2P were to have something like the Guardian project, where there's one cool app that you ship, like Courier on Android, that is a RSS news reader that uses Tor in the backend. If there was an application like that, or the distributed file system idea, where you just drop a file there and it's redundantly backed up, and you don't need to think about what exactly you're doing, that would definitely help not only user, but it would also help exposure for the I2P network.
There was a question.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's just this discussion is getting at a bit of a trend that's been building recently, where software is coming up in the form of apps that sort of work on various platforms, as opposed to various different types of software that you would use together on your own machine in different ways. So it seems like what in the current marketplace, what you really want to concentrate on is having each individual task be assigned to a specific app. I'm not sure if that's the easiest way to manage software like this. So generally, power users prefer to sort of understand how it all interacts.
That's a good point, that we are kind of a Swiss Army knife, and maybe we need to be just selling screwdrivers.
Like that's a difficult thing to sell right now.
I would add to that the approach that GNU PG has had for a long time has been power user.
Yes.
There are a lot of flags. There are a lot of features. I can only remember a handful of flags for how I use GNU PG, and I still have to read the man page every now and then just to make sure I know what I'm doing properly.
Yeah,
If there's something that is extremely easy to use, that you don't even have to think about using, that would help exposure completely.
David, what do you think about this? You have any advice on it, or any glaring problems you see from the outside looking at it in our little project?
Well, so I would start with some praise. And there's some things that I2P does very well, and I think you should continue to do those very well. So, for example, there are peer-to-peer file sharing services within I2P. And the thing that's impressed me most about it is in my academic research, I try and find viruses. That's a good day in the lab if we find a new virus or piece of malware. And we often look to file sharing services. About 30% of what you find on file sharing sites can be malicious in some way. There's a remarkably asymptotically zero, a very, very small amount of abuse that you ever see in the file sharing systems within I2P. And I don't know exactly what the mechanism that you've built around that, but there is some curation of content, some sense of whether it's pride or responsibility about the information that's offered, the quality measure. And so I would look to things that you do very well like that and keep those up and expand them, and maybe build applications that leverage the things that you do well. So you were also mentioning earlier that search is something that you're reluctant to fully implement because of the need to protect users as well. The concern that the community has about protecting others, I think, it is you can measure it. You can actually numerically measure it and see this in various different metrics, whether it's lack of malware or abuse issues. So I like that. So find out what you're doing in that space, or find the person responsible give them praise and ask them to do more and build something around what they've done. So that's good. In terms of killer apps, I don't, I think I would talk to some of the peer-to-peer file sharing systems like Vooz that are starting to use I2P as backend and have more open dialogues with them about what other applications would fit in. And also look at the quality of connection. Sometimes people are very intermittent in their connection, so it might not be that you're getting good quality circuits built from those users. Maybe it is. I would sort of look at the community that's participating and saying, wow, this is fantastic that we had these user bases, because they run Vooz 24/7, and there's a lot of circuits that we build around that. So I would start to look at these events that you were graphing, these spikes, and say, what is it about that user community that was good for us and also good for those users?
I think what you're getting at is that it really is the community that makes things work well.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I think we definitely have in I2P is a sense of community. We have sub-communities within it. But it isn't just a piece of software, as you see from all the yellow shirts. We really are a community, and we meet up once a year, at least twice a year this year. And that's really the best part of it. And if it weren't for the community, I would have bailed out of this thing long ago. So I got one last thing that I thought would be good to talk about. Nick, you have any? You talked about your past in consulting and bailing people out from lawsuits and disasters and privacy blunders. Do you have any stories you can tell us of any cautionary tales and anything from your consultant business?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I know I referenced this one a couple of times during my talk, but oh man, the Ashley Madison thing. Like, it was so
the
bad.
what thing?
The Ashley Madison
Okay.
data breach. I mean, the fact that you've now got a dump on the internet of people who are actively trying to sort of engage in all kinds of other activities. But alongside that, there was that huge one in the United States, and I can never remember what the acronym stands for, and I apologize, but OPM, where the agency in the U.S. is basically responsible for conducting background checks on federal employees and any number of other people who need a background check done. And they got breached, and all that information, didn't necessarily get leaked, but that's in the hands of somebody else. And while that's still maybe more of a quiet sort of private hack, lots of people know about it, and the fact that data was accessible in that fashion, you've got background checks on people that go back 15, 20 years that contain incredibly sensitive and private information. To my knowledge, I think I would attribute that as like the worst privacy fail of like ever.
From the user side, from the people here in this room, what's the lessons from Ashley Madison? Don't do that, or is there?
Don't put your real name if they're not making you. Never use your real name.
So I have a different opinion on that.
Okay.
So I really do not think that it is the user's fault that they're using the service. They
certainly not the user's fault.
Yeah, they want to go on a service to either reach out to people or have an affair or whatever. That's their personal life. It is the people making these systems' responsibility to make sure that their data is still secure, even after a breach. So OPM and Ashley Madison are very related just because of the sensitivity of what was released. You had people's affairs in there. You had people's not only real names, but real locations, phone numbers, any information that you could find. Even the OPM leak, you had information about people's drug use. You had information about if they ever stole anything, if they got in trouble with the law.
Psychological backgrounds. And
Exactly. These are all things that can come back at a later point that any adversary could potentially use to harm someone. So while we do need secure systems to make sure that this data is never leaked, if we have privacy by design systems like I2P or Tor, or we try and educate users to make best decisions as possible, I think that would be a much better lessons learned for Ashley Madison or OPM being leaked, data being leaked, than just, well, it's your fault because you decided to use this service. You decided to apply for the federal government, and sorry, your information is now leaked.
I guess the message is, if you have a service that you promise the user's privacy, you absolutely have to deliver on that. It sounds like they failed in that. Well, they absolutely did fail in that regard. Maybe the lesson for I2P is, I mean, a lot of people will look to the browser that they've used, the browser they've configured, and expect that what they do on I2P is private. It might be a useful plugin or application where one could self-audit and say, just show me any saved passwords I have in this particular browser. Show me any cookies or information that's been used to track me. There's a lot of Lightbeam and other applications that you might be able to offer as plugins to quickly build that capability up. If we learn anything from these sorts of breaches, it's that if you have a responsibility to maintain user privacy, then you need to deliver on that. And certainly I2P, is in that category where they're trying to keep users private. So maybe a self-audit mechanism built in that people can use to check whether or not they've misconfigured things, or use the browser they use for logging into their bank to also run I2P, things like that. It may be something that they can reflect upon and think about.
Well, thanks, guys. Normally what I do right now is throw it open to questions. However, I got word that the pizza is here, the free pizza. So, here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to thank our panelists for their... So here's the plan. If you have questions, you can ask them while you're eating pizza. We're going to start eating pizza, and we're going to start setting up for the crypto party. In about half hour or so, we're going to have Jay come up and explain to you all what a crypto party is. So he's going to explain that. And then after that, we're going to do crypto party. And I've never been to one, but as far as I understand it, it involves you opening up your laptops, and people help you do stuff. And one thing I know that we'll be able to do during the crypto party is the yellow shirt people will help you install I2P and learn about it that way, because it's a lot more fun to learn by doing than just to hear us tell you about it. So we're going to throw it over to pizza and beer time. Don't forget about the donations. Don't forget about the donations, beer, pizza, and we'll be back in half hour or so to hear Jay tell us about crypto party. Thanks. Good work. Good job, guys.